So I'm very happy to be here. This was my advisor's apartment back in the day, quite a long time ago. And I have, as Amy said, have been both, I'm a kind of a serial social entrepreneur. I keep starting organizations in my life just because it seems that I have a way of thinking about issues that keeps kind of needing a new package or a new holder for them. And one of the things that preparing for today has made me kind of think about and consider for myself is how I'm going to be talking about oral histories that I've done and how they influenced certain policy changes and different kinds of initiatives in New York primarily. But in a way, what I'm telling you is the story of my life too. And so in a strange way, I'm talking about oral history, but I'm also sort of sharing with you not only my history, but how doing oral history has impacted me personally and impacted the way I see the world and the work I do in the world. So I feel like it's all very connected for me in particular. I'm not good at the technology, and we've had Mac to PC problems, so hopefully everything will work out. And are you able to hear me in the back? Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. So I've sort of thought about this conversation tonight as a way of sort of delineating the process I've gone through in my life working with battered women and their children and trying to stop violence against women in a more global way as this sort of progression through providing services, then an opportunity I had to use storytelling as a way to drive policy change, and then really looking at the insights that women were sharing in their stories to think about how to try to embed change in communities as an alternative or as a supplement to policies and services. Because although services and policies are extremely important, the only way you really get social change to happen is to have real live individuals who live in our communities adopt the change strategies themselves and to begin to make change in their own lives, in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. So these are the things I think about all the time. I think about how is it that we as people who want to bring something positive in the world, how can we most effectively do that, and how can we use the limited resources and gifts that we have as individuals to make that change possible. So not my story is my story. This is the way I've done it, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So we called this talk Surfacing Solutions because for me, one of the very transformative moments that occurred in my life was when I started actually talking to battered women about what they thought solutions would be to their stories. So really for me, a lot of what I have tried to do as time has gone on after I did storytelling was to use the constituents that I was partnering with, their own voice and their own ideas to build change from the ground up. So I did start Sanctuary for Families in 1983, which was 29 years ago. How many years? 29. 29 years ago? Okay, 29 years ago. What are you trying to do? Make me feel very old?
It's 2013.
I
was born that year.
You were, oh gosh.
30 years ago.
Well, it will be in
December.
So it's maybe hard to believe, but before Sanctuary existed in the world, you had to, in New York City, you had to be on welfare to access services for domestic violence. You also had to be in a shelter to get any kind of assistance, so all services were linked to shelter. And basically what you had was a sort of system, a lot like today's homeless system. A lot of the agencies were actually run by the city of New York, and a few other nonprofits. There weren't that many domestic violence programs in the country, let alone in New York at that time. And when you sort of talk about how programs get developed, they're often designed to fit a funding stream. And in this case, the funding stream for domestic violence services in New York City was welfare funding. And so that's why there was that relationship between who could access services and who couldn't. So that meant that there were huge swaths of women who had no place to go, even if they wanted to go into a shelter program. And so Sanctuary started. I do have a Master's of Divinity, and the idea, the brilliant idea, which was extremely difficult to implement, was that the religious community in New York City would step forward to provide space for women to be housed in on a relatively short term. And we would have a network of sort of safe homes and safe apartments that would house women with this sort of spiritual idea of hospitality, and there wouldn't have to be a lot of money that changed hands, and it would be a way of providing services to women regardless of their income for a very for not a lot of money in very home-like situations. That was the sort of idea. And that also we would offer assistance and support to women whether they were in our shelter or not. So we not only developed a network of safe homes and safe apartments that were scattered all over New York City, some of which still, I think, exist. House of Mercy, are they still? No, not anymore. But for a long, long time, a lot of people really opened their homes and the places they lived in extremely generous ways and allowed women and children to come and stay with them. But we also decided that the way to really make an impact was to offer assistance to women all over New York City in kind of a support group setting or counseling. And so we offered that kind of assistance in church basements and schools and libraries and all different kinds of places where women might come together and provide each other with support with a kind of a facilitator that could help them. We also were the first organization to offer legal services to battered women and their children, specific to the domestic violence. And Sanctuary was we were the first recipient of a New York Women's Foundation grant. The New York Women's Foundation was started in like 1985, I think. And Sanctuary got the first grant along with two other women's organizations, and we were able to use that as a way to sort of prove that providing legal assistance to battered women was a sort of pathway to help them be empowered and liberated. And now, as we know, there are an awful lot of legal services for battered women and children, at least in New York, or way more than there used to be. And then we also were aware that, as now, there was a housing crisis then in New York City, and housing was unaffordable, and in particular for women that were trying to leave a violent home and become safe, finding a new place to live and having to have the first month's rent and a month and all the startup costs was nearly impossible. So we also started the first long-term housing program in New York and maybe even the country for battered women to be able to stay in for a longer period of time, now called transitional housing. So again, this is just sort of a reiteration of what I just said. We used to call Sanctuary for Families the United Nations. It probably still is. And I want to acknowledge that there are 4 people from Sanctuary for Families here, and I'm so happy that they're here. Laurel Eisner, who's the Executive Director of Sanctuary. Beth Silverman-Yam, who's been there forever and does all sorts of exciting things. Marianne Malman, who is on the board and has been on the board forever and ever. And Stephanie Ferdman, who is also on the board, aren't you?
No longer.
No longer, but has been, and has been a strong supporter and ally of Sanctuary for Families. And Sanctuary is bigger and better than it ever was. So, in 1987, a very significant event occurred in New York City which had a very profound impact on me and launched my involvement in oral history. And for those of you who are older than 29 years old, they remember that Joel Steinberg, who was a wealthy lawyer and lived on, I think, East 10th Street in the Village, killed his daughter, whose name was Lisa Steinberg, and had an us bound it's hard to even tell that she's a female in this picture. Their photograph was all over the newspapers on morning in November, I think, or October, the fall of 1987. And although it became clear through testimony that Hedda Nussbaum gave, they were both charged with the murder of the little girl, even though it was clear that Joel had, actually done the abuse that killed her. But it was thought that Hedda Nussbaum had never sought help for being a battered woman, when in fact, as the story evolved, she had sought help many, 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 many times, and had been sort of like rejected. She was told to go back home. She was told it was her fault. She was told that it wasn't bad enough. She was told all the sort of stereotypical things that you think aren't really true. People don't really say that. Well, they really say that. And so Hedda Nussbaum looked like she'd just done 40 rounds with Muhammad Ali when her photograph appeared on the tabloids the next day. And there was a group of domestic violence advocates who were sort of shaken up by this whole fact that there was a dead girl, a little girl. There was another child in the home who had also been abused, but not as severely, and that there was an abused mother who was being accused of murdering her child, when in fact the story was much more complicated than that. For me, this was, as they say, an inflection point in my life, because I was enmeshed in running Sanctuary and was very devoted to the work that we were doing, but also realized that we were not necessarily looking as closely as we might at what was happening to the children. And we weren't looking at the systems that women were interacting with that might either help protect or, in fact, give them a very negative response and make them not seek help, even if they were seeking help. So fellowships have sort of dotted my life. I became a Revson Fellow in 1988, right, soon after this. And I was still running Sanctuary, and what I started to do was sort of look in a kind of academic way as to whether there was information written on this nexus between the abuse of women and the abuse of children. And at that time, maybe very hard for all of us to believe, there was nothing. There was a lot of information. Come on in. Written about child abuse. Obviously, the field of child abuse is many decades old, and there was a lot of literature on that. On the other hand, there was a new and burgeoning set of literature on battered women, but there was literally not a single article that I could find in an entire year at the Social Work Library at Columbia University on the overlap between the two issues. So of course, I decided I had to do something about that. So I decided that I should leave Sanctuary for Families, and I should dedicate the next decade of my life to addressing this overlap between adult domestic violence and child maltreatment. So I left Sanctuary in 1991, and I began thinking about how would I learn about this issue, since there was nothing written on it yet, and I had some knowledge about it, but there obviously needed to be a lot more understanding about what was going on. So I started with this idea that I would develop, I would be a little social scientist, and I would talk to all my friends who were in PhD programs in epidemiology and sociology, and I would do like a survey, and I would send out 200, and I would get some N back, and I would N it all, and I would do all this data analysis, and I would come up with knowledge. And I realized after trying, kind of experimenting, never sending them out, but trying to come up with a tool that I thought reflected what I wanted to do, I realized that it wasn't really meeting what I thought was the important issues. So, oops, where's my, uh-oh, I think there's a missing slide here. And so I'll fill in, unless it's farther along and I misplaced it. But, again, in the theme of coffee being the beverage of relationships, I ended up having coffee with Mary Marshall Clark, who I went to graduate school here with, and was then the assistant director at the oral history archives. There was no master's degree program then at Columbia University, and I was, kvetching to her about this dilemma, and she said, well, why don't you do an oral history? And I'm like, doing. That seemed like a good idea. And she also hooked me up with the women at Hunter College who were running the Puerto Rican Studies Department. Come on in. And they were actually using oral history at that time to document the lives of Puerto Rican immigrants to New York City, primarily women, but not exclusively women. And they were engaged in a multi-year oral history project where they were documenting their lives and their experiences in New York City. And they embraced what I was doing and me, and basically trained me in oral history. So I was sort of on-the-job learner in terms of learning how to do oral history. And so what ended up happening was I did an oral history project where I interviewed 45 women who were abused women and were mothers. That was my kind of criteria. They had to have had children because I was obviously interested in exploring this relationship between being a woman who was abused and having children. And what I had learned already from more informal conversations with women at Sanctuary was that when I would ask them why they stayed for the length of time that they stayed in the relationships, they would always say that they stayed because they thought it was the best thing that they could do for their children. And then when I asked them why they left, they all said that they left because they thought it was the best thing that they could do for their children. So there was this dialectic there was this consistent desire on their part to protect their children, but there were different strategies that they needed to employ at different points along that path of trying to enhance their own safety and their children's safety. They felt that they couldn't afford to leave because they were not earning enough money. They felt that the kids loved their dad and that they didn't want to break that relationship. They felt that they'd never lived on their own and that there was no way that they would really survive. They felt that they would be stalked and hunted down and killed, and that if they left, that they were actually increasing the risk to themselves and their children rather than, so everyone goes, well, why don't you leave? Well, I don't leave because it's actually the smartest thing I can do. But that's not often the way we look at it. So in doing these oral histories, I learned several pretty significant things. This sort of motif of trying very hard to find strategies to protect their children was the most important value that these women held all through their life as a battered mother. They tried many different strategies, often using their own bodies as a way to protect their children from abuse. They also then, at some point in time, realized that this wasn't really working and they were going to need to do something else, and there was often a moment in their experience of the abuse that caused them to recognize that it was time to go. And that moment was the moment when their child witnessed them being abused. And when the mother saw in their child's eyes this moment of fear and terror, when she saw that, that was sort of like the lightning bolt, kind of like in a cartoon, the goddess comes down with the lightning bolt. That was, for almost all of the women, the moment in time when they realized that it was time to go. Whether they were scared to go, whether it seemed like the right time to go, for them it didn't matter anymore. They saw this terror reflected in their own child's eyes, and that was the sort of opportunity that they took to leave. And pretty much every single one of them, they may not have gotten out that day or that week or that month, but they marked that moment as the moment that they changed their mind about whether to stay or whether to go, for them in their own mind. And the other thing that was very, I had no idea that I would learn this, was that none of the women had ever used domestic violence services. They had all used family, friends, religious leaders, neighbors, and so I was very surprised by this, but I was also sort of shaken up by this and made to sort of think a little bit differently about how it is that we make change happen if so many women are not accessing the services that we have. There's clearly, I mean, at Sanctuary, and it probably is still true today, there are more women who want the service than we ever had resources to provide. So in the sense of being a provider, there's way more need than there are resources. But then again, there's a whole other, it's like the iceberg, you know, the part that's submerged is the part that you don't really see, because those are the people that aren't reaching out. But those are the people that are sort of dealing with this on their own in the community. And these were people that I thought about working with. Yes?
And how did you find them if they weren't connected into these?
You know, they call it the snowball, you know, sort of. I did put an ad in the paper, and I was able to get sort of a first few women that were interested in being interviewed that way. And then someone knew I was doing this, and they told their neighbor and told their friend. And so it was a very organic process of attracting women who were willing to do it. And there was clearly, you know, self-selection there. You know, I'm not saying this is a scientific survey. I'm just saying that because there were probably people that heard about the project that had no interest in you know, undergoing this very intimate kind of interview process. So there was that going on. But nonetheless, these were women that were sort of randomly getting in touch with me, and were in a way representative of the women of New York. You know, they were from all the different boroughs, they were very diverse ethnically, they were diverse economically, so it was a very interesting group of stories, partly because of the common themes. You know, despite the differences in who these women were, there were real common themes in their story. Yeah?
When you open sanctuary to women who are not necessarily poor, why couldn't wealthy upper middle class women, I assume you got some, why couldn't they just go up to their sister-in-laws or go buy a second home and someplace else?
Well, they might be able to do that eventually, but you know, there are all sorts of emotional reasons why women might not want to do that. Because they were concerned about their own economic viability, even if there was a lot of money in the household, how to get it, how to deal. If she had a lot of money, so did he, usually, and that meant that he was going to hire a very fancy lawyer, and he was going to make her life miserable. A lot of batterers are very adept at economic abuse and might have ways of freezing accounts or siphoning money away, terminating credit cards. There were all sorts of ways that batterers were able to continue to control women. I mean, we worked with women who were doctors and lawyers and stockbrokers and politicians, and so in the sense that domestic violence is a pretty democratic problem, women with resources definitely had more resources, and many of them ultimately did go move in with their sister, or you know, for 2 months, and then get an apartment in Cleveland, or you know, wherever they wanted to. Cleveland, sorry, Cleveland. You know. So that definitely did happen, and you know, in terms of using services with domestic violence, there are a lot of barriers to people using services at all income levels, but well-to-do women don't use services because they're ashamed. They're ashamed in different ways that have to do with, you know, kind of protection of their class status, whereas women in poorer neighborhoods may not access services because they feel like, I mean, the police in particular, in poor communities, the police aren't necessarily considered allies, you know, and so there's a lot of stories you get from women, regardless of their neighborhood, but in particular in poor neighborhoods, as we know, that police intervention is not particularly friendly to them. So, and you know, women are very attuned and sensitive to these kind of social cues and kind of emotional issues that arise with them. Are there other hands? So, okay, now I have a little audio here. So I have a confession sort of to make right now, and that is that all these recordings are on cassettes. Remember cassettes? And when I prepared this, I didn't even have these interviews in my home with me. They're someplace else. And so, but I did have the transcripts. And so you'll notice that all the women sound a lot like me because I'm reading from the transcripts. Okay, so I apologize for that, and I know all this is motivating me to be like a better archivist, right? No? Oh, sorry.
And I did go down to Family Court on Parsons Boulevard in Jamaica. And I spoke to them about what had happened, and I told them that he pulled a machete on me. I told them the whole story, and I told them how I had been abused before. I had had an order of protection. She told me, well, where's the machete? I said, well, the police officer told me to throw it down the stairs. And she said, well, you don't have any proof that he had a machete. I said, a police officer told me to throw the machete down the incinerator. And I said, this was on Saturday. I'm here. It's Monday. Do you mean to tell me I had to keep that machete in my house and bring it to you so that you could see it? And she says, yeah. I said, the only way I can get any service from you is if I'm dead.
So that was a common, that's a common theme with battered women, is this feeling that help is only available if I'm, you know, laying in a casket, and that help is not really helpful. You know what I mean? There's help, but it's not help that's really addressing my needs. Okay, so here's a little more of Alyssa reading the transcript.
And it's like, I think, well, if my son wasn't sitting there, would he really have killed me? I don't know. I really don't know how far it would have gone. There's really no saying. I just thank God that my son was sitting there and he happened to look up at my son's face, and my son was like, Mommy! And I was like, I couldn't breathe. I really couldn't breathe. And that's when he let go. But it's like, if he wasn't sitting there, how much longer would he have done that to me?
So I guess you can say it had a palliative effect on the batterer as well. that sort of visual cue between the child and either adult had a very powerful impact. And you know, I have another little here of this.
That was the most horrible thing of it all. I know that I was not performing as a mother should. I tried my best, but I was so frightened and I didn't know where to turn. I was so upset all the time. It affected my children terribly. My two younger ones, they called the police all the time. It was horrible for them to live through this. How abusive he was. How they never forgave him for it, never. It affected my two older ones terribly. I was so worried about getting him upset and just trying to have somewhat of a tranquil life because I thought it would be good for them. But it was the worst thing I ever did in my life.
So obviously she didn't feel all that good in the final analysis about how long she had stayed. This woman stayed a very long time with her batterer, and again, that story is one that I've listened to a lot because she went to her rabbi often to try to get support from the rabbi to help the husband stop the violence. But again, you know, there's this way in which people want to see the best in people and they minimize the violence. And so instead of helping the woman helping her be safer and figure out ways of doing that, there was a lot of sort of back patting and you know, kind of like you can do better. It wasn't like he denied the violence, the rabbi, but he didn't really do anything that was helpful for this woman in particular, or the husband for that matter. So, and here's some little snippets on women, you know, relying on their family and friends.
We got, I don't know how many people, all of my nephew's friends, which were teenagers, really big boys at the time. There must have been about 8 or 9 of them. My neighbor, Candy, my sister's friends, Anne. Oh, so many people came over to help me move. We had the movers there early that morning. By the time he got home from work, which was about 3 o'clock, I had everything moved and put away in my sister's house. I went to my job and I got all my stuff out of there and into the truck and in the car, and then it was hidden in the house. He didn't know what had hit him.
Nice comment. He didn't know what it is. Although he ended up tracking her down, showing up in front of her new apartment with the trunk of his car filled with weapons, and he asked her to come out of the car, said, I want to show you something. And he opened up the trunk of his car and he said, if you don't come back home, I'm killing your nephews, which were the ones that she had asked to help her because he knew who would help. So she ended up going back.
And that entire day when my mother said to think about it, she said, make sure it's what you want, because once we start doing this, you realize you can't go back. And my brother, he was a cop, he said, Marion, don't go back, because it only gets worse each time. And it's true, when I think back of every time something happened and he apologized, it did. It got worse and worse.
Cheery. So, you know, these are just obviously very short pieces from a lot of cassette tapes. I actually only could afford to have, I think I have 10 of them transcribed. And nowadays, there are new ways of kind of doing that. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but there's a lot more material I have than I've even been able to really kind of reconnect with sitting in a box. So here's another interesting change that happened. Again, not over coffee this time, but I had friends who worked in different political offices in New York City pretty much at the same time I was doing these oral histories. A very close friend whose name was Ellen Dougherty that worked for Ruth Messenger, who was then the borough president of New York. And I had been friends with another woman named Ronnie Eldridge, who was a city councilwoman and the head of the women's committee of the city council for, and I'd known Ronnie since actually I was here at Union in other ways. So these were both women who had very high political positions in New York City at the time. I ran into Ellen at a demonstration of some kind. I think it had to do with Nicaragua, actually. And I started telling her about these interviews and how powerful they were and how insightful the women were about what had happened to them and what they wished had happened to them and their interactions with various systems. They'd gone to the hospital with injuries, they'd called the police and not gotten what they wanted. They got kicked out of public housing because they didn't have any money. You know, there were all these connections that they had to city agencies, and it seemed that there were some powerful ways of using their stories to make some kind of change happen in New York City. And Ellen was like, yeah, okay, let's do it. So I met with Ruth and Ronnie and Ellen and I, and we decided that what we were going to do was to create a task force. And we were going to invite the women who had been part of this oral history project to participate in the task force, in the sense that we were really using their stories and their ideas as a platform to make this change happen. So that was, I was the communicator of that, and women were invited to participate. And we put together a very quick, almost like tribunal kind of situation, where we had each woman whose story sort of emphasized a certain agency in New York City give testimony, which I worked very hard with them to kind of construct the testimony, because testimony is quite a bit different than your oral history. But we used their stories as a way of crafting the testimony. they gave testimony in front of a group of other influential advocates in New York City, people who were in the court system, people who were in the police department, domestic violence advocates who were working in organizations, people in the child welfare system, all different people who came together in issue-specific committees, listened to the testimony of these women, and then there was a facilitated process where we used their stories to sort of critique the way the city agency worked at that time and made recommendations for the way the city agencies should work in the future. And this was the document that was published out of this task force. And we also, a friend of mine knows a photographer named Donna Ferrato who had, right before this, published a book called Living with the Enemy, which had a very powerful photographic essay of domestic violence scenes. And she donated her photography to the project. And what we were able to do then was to come up with an analysis of 8 city agencies with a story that sort of initiated each chapter and recommendations for how things would change. And I will pass that around. That's my only copy, if you can believe it. And it was published, Ruth Messenger's office paid for the publication of this book, and it was before the days of internet attachments. I don't know if any other form exists of that. It could be scanned. I actually have done that once. I scanned it and made a kind of a bound copy, but it's a very dear thing to me. So these are the different city agencies that we analyzed. The women were engaged in the process of making the recommendations. Their stories were this sort of launching, a very emotional way to sort of engage people around this conversation of making change. It was very impactful for people who were sort of bureaucrats or, sort of long-time social service people. It sort of like cracked a little bit of the veneer, and it was a very powerful experience and a very productive experience. And again, as I mentioned in the class earlier that I was talking to, it was also a moment in time that was sort of a perfect storm, because the Violence Against Women Act was just being passed for the very first time, so there was conversation at a federal level about domestic violence in a way that had never really been talked about before. And there were huge amounts of resources that were being pushed out to states and cities, primarily in the criminal justice system, but there was a flood of money. There was also a mayoral election that was just being started, where David Dinkins was running against Giuliani first term. And they both decided that this policy report was something that they could get behind, even though one was a very sort of harsh Republican and one was a much more progressive Democrat. But they both took this book up, and you would see them, giving speeches, waving the book in the air, going, and when I'm mayor, I will blah, 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 blah. I'll do whatever it says in this book. And Giuliani won, and as we know, and he actually created a mayor's task force to end family violence based on this policy reform book, and it did launch a lot of changes. Each police precinct in New York City got a domestic violence police officer. All of the city hospitals, the HHC hospitals, I don't think they even call them that anymore, each one hired a social worker to work in the emergency room department to help identify and support battered women who came into the emergency room. We developed a whole system of housing vouchers for people in public housing to support them as battered women. We helped change some of the restrictions about battered women living in housing, in public housing, and whether they could or couldn't live there. It gets technical. And we also were able to get the, what was then called SSC, which stood for the
Special
Thank you.
Services for Children.
Thank you. And I see Elaine back there. It's now called ACS. has had many different initials that they use. And they started a special office for the overlap for domestic violence. So a lot happened. A lot was really stimulated by this report. And it's another long story about what has ended up happening. Many things have ended, many things have been good, many things have not been so good. Things have sort of fallen off the wagon, and Laurel and I were just talking about things that don't exist now, that did exist 10 years ago. So maybe it's time for another Laurel.
That's it.
Something or
Or
other. I worked hard on that. Very hard on that. Yes.
Good question.
Yes.
What was the impact of doing these oral histories for the women themselves and who were involved both in the project as a whole, in the initial research that you did, and also for the testimony?
Yes. There were, in a general way, sort of three major reasons why women wanted to participate, and then some fairly consistent reflections once they had participated. And the reasons they all gave for wanting to participate was that they wanted their story, which they often didn't feel very good about, to help someone else. They thought, if my story can help one other person, that's good enough for me. I'm willing to spill my guts. I'm willing to talk about this. They also felt, and this was sort of a reflection after it was more completed, that they had never, ever been asked to tell their story. They might have been at an intake interview, or they might have been at a therapist's office, or they might have gone to the doctor and tried to describe, but they've never actually been asked to tell their story. And as those of us who are kind of addicted to oral history like to say, the event of the interview itself has a very transforming, can have, it's not inevitable, but it can have a very transformative consequence for the person being interviewed as well as for the interviewer. It's a very deep and profound connection that you can make with the person that you're interviewing. And although that's sort of ineffable, it also is very powerful, and both people feel it. And so when women were kind of done with this, and a lot of these interviews were done on multiple occasions, so we're not one sitting. So there was time in between for reflection, and every time I went back to do another stage of the interview, I tried to make sure that they felt okay about it, and talk to them about what did they feel about it, what was this doing for them? Was it triggering them? Was it making them feel better, or was it? But they pretty much to one felt that it was very clarifying. It helped them see their story as a part of their life rather than their whole life. That was one thing. It helped them see, partly because of the way maybe I asked questions, that they succeeded at things rather than failed at things. And it was important for me to help them connect with the fact that they had done the best they could do to protect their children, because that was clearly the thing that they were all most concerned about. And they may have felt quite guilty about what they did or didn't do during the time that they were involved with the batterer, but in fact, they had done whatever was in their power at the time to protect their children, in some cases to great physical harm for themselves, throwing themselves in between, their child and the batterer, or kind of precipitating a battering in order to kind of get the kid out of the way. So I think that having a sensitive, interviewer is really key. But I think just the process of telling their story in a way that they were in control of, that they could roll it out however they felt was the right way to do it, was very it gave them insight and a sense of control. And it wasn't without its moments of deep sadness, there was a lot of crying, and there was a lot of, I was concerned at times that it was not a good thing for, but I tried as much as I could to help contextualize it and to give people referrals and as I said earlier, for many of the women I was in touch with for an extended period of time. And then the ones that did participate in the tribunal sort of aspect of things, they were women that felt very strongly about how their story could actually make kind of a major change. And they felt great about that. They felt very great about that. And that was scary, to go up in front of, judges and lawyers and, police officers and to talk was a scary experience, but it was one that gave them a great sense of power and control. Gave them something like that. Any other questions? Yeah.
And in the same vein, how did you handle or continue to handle the emotional impacts with all of this?
Yeah, it was very hard at times. I mean, even reading the transcripts, while I was doing this was, it brought me right back to a lot of the interview sessions, which I remember quite, deeply. So I had a group of friends and peers who were involved in varying levels in the project, and they were very supportive, and I tried to take care of myself as well as find ways of helping take care or having the women take care of themselves. I spent a lot of time with the women. There was some social stuff that went on. Some of the women connected with each other and became friends. So it was a very I don't know if that means it's informal or what, but it was a very friendly, kind of situation. And it was hard to listen to all these stories. But I've been listening to all these stories my whole life, so it's sort of something I do, something I do. Yeah.
Was there any backlash against the women by batterers after sharing their stories and having these oral histories conducted and also having them published?
Not that I know of. And a lot of these women were out of their relationships for long enough that I think they felt that they had both a little bit of perspective and a little bit of security, from that. And it's not impossible that something happened that I don't know about, because a lot of these relationships, it was not easy to have it be broken off in a way that was safe. And because all these women have children with these men, if you've got a kid with someone, you're going to deal with them pretty much for the rest of your life. So there was a way in which they had to continue to have relationships with them. But I don't think that it ever exposed any of them in a way that was sort of publicly threatening to them. We took great pains to, some of the interviews were done like behind a screen, like you see on crime shows. So, okay, onward. Can anyone give me a time check, because I turned off the light?
5%.
7%. So, the other, this is not completely chronological, and I'll sort of go kind of do a U-turn at some point during the presentation, but I wanted to kind of segue right into the other kind of major oral history I did in family violence, which is with men. Again, I was a Rockefeller Fellow in 1998, and that was at Columbia, and again, supported by Mary Marshall. And what I wanted to do in that oral history was to interview men. And I was interested in, there's a lot of bad stuff that men do, as we all know. But I was also concerned that in New York at the time, the only way for men to get services, similar to women earlier on, was that they had to be arrested. The only batterer's intervention that was available, unless you were paying a private therapist or something like that, was to be arrested and be sort of adjudicated into a batterer's program. And it may be quite similar now, but that was it. That was the only, And I was sort of like, well, that doesn't seem right. Why do you have to get to that point, when you're like arrested? Because you've probably been beating someone for years or for decades even by the time you're actually going to get arrested. Why isn't there something earlier on? And I thought that it would be really interesting to interview men who had grown up in violent homes but were not violent. Because I thought, well, they might have some insights into what could help be more preventative rather than, kind of, again, crisis, endgame sort of interventions. And also there's a lot of conversation in the domestic violence movement about whether batterers intervention even works. And one of the things I was that, well, maybe one of the reasons it doesn't work is because it's so far down the road. You've kind of got like a habitual criminal by the time you're providing them with any intervention. So maybe there are other ways of doing this, and maybe something different would work in a different way. So, okay, so, and also battered women, when you talk to battered women, even if they want to leave their batterer, many of them want their men to get help. We are altruists, us women. It's the A gene we have, and the A gene means we're always trying to take care of everybody, and even if she never wants to lay eyes on the guy again, she often feels that she wants him to get some assistance, and sometimes that's motivated by the fact that he's the father of their children, and she knows that they're going to be a constant relationship with him. So in terms of sort of giving women something that they were very insistent on, it seemed important too. And I was trying to sort of frame the questions in a way that would surface, again, use that word, surface the assets that men had. And if women wanted to protect their children, and that was a way of motivating and educating and connecting with women, well, maybe there was something similar for men that would be a way to sort of build a hook. This is a photograph from the Brides March. Has anyone ever seen one of the Brides Marches? Alice Rickert, I think, was the woman's name. She was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, or ex-fiance, on her wedding day. She was in her wedding dress, she was getting ready to be married, and her former abusive boyfriend, fiance, found her and slaughtered her. And this man that we see right here is her brother. And this was a rally that we had, and some of these men were men I talked to about being interviewed, so this was kind of a segue into the project. So what I was interested in trying to understand is what is it that helps men from being violent? And I'm not sure that these snippets actually are the best ones for that, but these actually are men speaking. I did have those interviews in that session.
Being a man and having to have like a man who gets be caught up in that web of this violence tends to kind of block it all out. And I know I read this book that has called somewhere. It's called the male rape case book, and it talks about how a lot of men who are batterers and who are survivors, a lot of them take it out just in such an obscure way, and the only thing they need is the representative for them to talk about the pain. And when they talk about the pain, it tends to kind of, but I mean, I've seen that. I know myself, I was like so angry and bitter all the time. Like, when I used to see like movies and there was a part where a guy just like grabs her, I just walk out, I get angry. Or when, when there's like a male party, and I remember one friend, he had like porn magazine, kind of like women being tied up and all that. I used to get like angry and walk out. But I learned, learn.
Can you hear it? It's kind of muddled. The sound quality is not fabulous. I'm sorry. Let's see if this one.
I love my grandmother. And my mom doesn't even talk to my grandmother. It's kind of a strange thing, but she was severely beat upon by her husband. And
growing up, you know, I heard stories. My mom would tell me how my father beat on her, and then my grandmother would tell me stories about how my father beat on my mother and beat on her, and then how her husband beat on her. You know, it was just so. You know, I had it kind of instilled in me at a pretty young age that beating on women is not a good thing. And so, you know, for people that cross that line, you know, I don't. You know, if it's alcoholism. And they're willing to work on it, you know, I think that you can do something. I mean, I've got an undergrad degree in social work, and I also have an undergrad degree in philosophy, and I tried to be a social worker for a while, but I wasn't very good. And, you know, for people that have already crossed those lines, you know, they have to, you know, have a real strong commitment.
It takes a long time.
And it takes a
not
long
a quick fix.
It's and I think that you're always it's kind of like alcoholic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's always potentially there.
Yeah.
So this was a smaller group of, I think there were like 16 or 18 men that I interviewed, and again, like I said, these aren't the real nuggets of what I think was revealed in their interviews, but to sort of summarize, because I've listened to them all, is that all of these men had a very positive relationship with an adult woman. They had an empathic relationship with an adult woman, and that allowed them to, instead of see their partner as they, you know, became an older person as an object, it allowed them, and it's very simple, it would allow them to see their partner as a full human being that had desires and interests and rights just like they did. And the other thing that was key in their insights was that as children, they experienced terror in their homes, as some of them were very physically abused themselves, sexually abused themselves, but some of them were more witnesses to a family setting with a lot of violence. And sort of like this moment where the child acts as this kind of catalyst with the women, this connection with themselves as terrified children came out in their stories a lot, that felt like an opportunity to help a batterer reconnect with the time in their life when they were, in fact, not the batterer, but the scared little boy that was hiding in the closet or under the bed or calling the police or whatever that moment was. That there was a way that sort of humanized the situation again and put them in the role of being a victim as well, and also not just a victim, but a victim who was horrified about what was going on, not one that had been inured to this and made excuses for it, but one that was just in awe in a bad way of what was happening. And I had started Connect by this point, and what we tried to do was create a sort of conversation with men and boys in communities that would help to kind of highlight this issue of what it was like to be a father and what it was like to be a little child, and how fathers were also interested in protecting their children just like women were. It was different, and they had different ways of expressing that, but we tried to sort of build this facilitated process where men could have conversations about what it was like to be a child in a home where there was violence, and what was it like to now be a father, and as someone who was, did they want their child to grow up in a similar kind of setting with a similar kind of experience, and sort of turn out to be a violent person that couldn't have a trusting relationship with their own partner, with their own children. And that was also a kind of an amazing process, and we tried very hard to have that become a project that the city's child welfare system bought into, because we thought that it was a potentially powerful way to provide a preventive service for people that were where there had been an identification of child maltreatment, but it was kind of a little unclear about all the dynamics in the family. And we ran that program for a while, but it never really caught on with. There was no consistent funding stream for it, and we were kind of not able to run it for that long. But we made some very powerful connections in communities around it, because we were talking about violence in a different way. There's, I think, a way that some people in communities, and men in particular, feel alienated from the movement of trying to stop violence in homes, and this was a way of engaging them in conversations that was easier for them to participate in. So to kind of double back again on some of the things I was talking about with the women, this idea that there were a lot of women who were not using services was something domestic violence services, was something that I ended up thinking a lot about, and thought, well, if they're not using services and they're living in that building and that building and that neighborhood, well, where should we be working? Like, maybe we should be working in the community with people instead of and partnering with communities around building change from the ground up, rather than providing only sort of services and that kind of system where you have to access the system and you have to go someplace to get what you need, but to try to build change from a community level on up. So it's hard to say exactly when I started Connect, because there are sort of like it sort of started and sort of started and sort of started. But Connect is the second organization I started in New York City, and I do say I started it in 1993, which is sort of true and sort of not true, but we'll just leave it at that for now. And Connect was this effort to take these ideas that the community was the locus of change, that the community was the place that insights had to be lifted in partnership with, and that those insights had to be then, that we would partner with community members and we would build change from the community and from the ground up. And that's what Connect is focused on. Connect is focused on engaging in communities with regular people who are living, working, shopping, walking to the subway, living in that building, working in that bodega, cutting hair in that salon, whatever it is, working with them as if they are partners in solving this problem, and providing them with support, assistance, ideas in the heyday of Connect, actually re-granting money to community groups. That was the days when there was more resources around. And really working with them as if we were kind of community organizers, and they had the ideas, they had the know-how. We had to find ways of supporting them in identifying and sustaining change initiatives within their communities. And what that has meant is that Connect has about 180 partner organizations around New York City that are small, grassroots, primarily community-based organizations, that instead of going in and saying, you need to do this, 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 and this, we talk to them, say, what you doing, how you doing it, do you deal with domestic violence, what do you do if someone comes in with that problem, and sort of work with them to build their awareness and insight around the problem. And one of the most powerful ways that we decided to do that was through a grassroots education model, and we developed a kind of domestic violence college, if you want to, for lack of a better word, and we recruited people from all over New York City to participate in a free 40-hour class, basically. Everyone had to take the sort of 101 class, and then you could move up through a series of electives, and the electives were on working with immigrant women, understanding financial abuse, how to engage in conversations with men who are abusive and violent, how to reach out to men and boys. There were many, many different things. We had special classes for clergy, we had special classes for doulas, we had special classes for lawyers. We tried in every way we could think of to provide an educational process for people where they could learn what we felt were the most important insights, knowledge, and values about this issue, and that they could then return to their community, whether that was, they were a tenant organizer, or they were a nurse, or they were a teacher, they were a coach, and they could create something that worked for them. And so now there are, support groups and ESL classes where women are taught about domestic violence, and there are theater productions, and there are oral history projects, and there are ministers, and there are safe houses. There are all sorts of little tiny grassroots initiatives that have been sparked, in all over New York City, that Connect continues to try to support in whatever way it's able to provide support in. So we sort of flipped the frame. We've sort of gone from this idea that people come to us, and we've gone to them, and we've provided them with pathways to learn and make changes on their own terms. And so that's what Connect does. So really, and this is again a reiteration of that. And so, Connect has done some really interesting things to develop a kind of conversations with community members. And one of the most interesting things we did were street surveys. We went door to door and hung out at subway stations and went to health fairs with a simple survey where we asked people questions about child abuse and adult domestic violence in ways that tried to assess their tolerance or lack of tolerance for domestic violence. And what you find, and let me back up a second, because most of the communities that we have partnered with have been communities in New York City that people would call distressed, or like multi-problem communities. So these are communities that people tend to approach as if they're just a bundle of problems. So we have gone in with the idea that this is a community with a bundle of assets. And what we want to do is we want to identify what those assets are, and we want to work in ways that are going to strengthen those assets. So what we've done is that we've gone in to try to tap people's ideas of how they would solve the problem of domestic violence in their community. And then we're able to use their own insights in campaigns and sort of feedback loops. So we can then return to the community after we've sort of looked at the data and say, 85% of people in this community think that domestic violence is a serious problem and that there should be multiple ways of addressing it. Now, no one says that. People say that there were 5 million arrests at this police precinct and 27 women were killed. Important information, but not the kind of information that you want to hear if you are trying to inspire positive change all the time. You kind of might want to be inspired, and you might want to think that you and your community have assets that can be built upon to make that change happen. So that's, I think, another important thing that Connect has done, is that it's really tried to find a way of addressing a problem, a very serious and tragic problem, in a way that assumes that people want the best, that assumes that people want to see the change happen, and that we're helping them surface those ideas and then build on those ideas. I am so thirsty and hot. Connect is not as robust an organization as it was when we first started getting funding, but it was really started with those ideas of gathering stories and gathering the insights of community members, and then building strategies around those. So we call that community engagement. Pretty much the same thing. So, and to sort of cap this all, oh yes, ma'am.
So, ma'am? What were some examples of community-based ideas that were innovative to that community, or that were unique to that community? And could they be applied across communities? And then one other question is the connection between adult violence and child maltreatment. Did you ever research cases where the children themselves were the target of abuse, and whether or not that impacted how quickly women left or not? Or when you talk about child maltreatment, are you talking kind of about the insidiary effects of the adult violence in their home?
Yeah, okay. So try to answer the first question about what kinds, sort of examples of some of the initiatives that might have gotten started. Was working with barbers and beauticians around helping them finding ways of starting a conversation in the beauty parlor or the barber shop about domestic violence, helping them understand what some of the signs, physical signs in particular for women might be, so that it would help to sort of, and really giving the hairdressers the sort of language and the idea that this was a topic that they could bring up, and that it might actually be very liberating instead of intrusive for the person to bring it up. So that's one example. Another is when we did a lot of this community engagement work, a lot of people said that the first person they would turn to or did turn to when they had a crisis in their family was a religious leader. And so we did a lot of work trying to interface with religious leaders in the communities we were working with, because they were natural leaders there. And if you've ever tried to work with religious leaders around an issue that has to do with gender, violence, or reproduction, it's a very, very difficult. It's very difficult. It's a patriarchal world. That's a very patriarchal system, and it's a very long process of creating affirming conversations in that world. And so one of the things we tried to do, we tried to find religious leaders who were willing to have the conversation and could then sort of network with their colleagues. And sometimes that was done by neighborhood, sometimes that was done by faith groups. So, you'd find an imam who was willing to talk, and then you'd have a way of him reaching out to his fellow imams. We did a lot of work with ESL classes, because these were women new to the country, these were women new to the laws here, these were women who were like extracted from their cultural context, and they were really vulnerable, and there was a lot of violence in their lives. And so an ESL class was a way of interjecting. We could use stories and have them read little articles, or that would be the reading assignment, was something about domestic violence, which would then precipitate a conversation. And then another big thing was with doulas. When women are pregnant and giving birth, it's a very vulnerable time, and it's a time where violence is often escalating. And so we sort of use doulas as a vector into people's lives, as a way of trying to provide support for women, and if need be, find ways of protecting them, from the guy in different ways. So, okay, so that's one. And then, I personally have done work in really the child maltreatment area, sort of specifically. I think that in almost all cases, I shouldn't say this, but really 80% of cases where there's child maltreatment, there's an adult who's being abused as well. And so often, even though it appears that only the child is a victim, that's often not the case. And the fact that that's not seen, that often the mother is also abused, although it's not always the mother, that complicates the way people intervene, because they think that the child is the sole victim. And it was certainly the case with Hedda Nussbaum and Joel Steinberg. Lisa Steinberg was dead, so obviously that was pretty serious, but Hedda Nussbaum was accused of murder. And it took quite a while to sort of have that unravel enough that it was clear that it was pretty obvious to anyone who looked at her, but obviously that wasn't the legal system's approach. The more research is done about child maltreatment and adult domestic violence, the more we found that the overlap is huge. And I did write a whole book on this, and so I'm pretty well versed in that data. And in cases where the woman is the perpetrator, or which is true, that is the case in some ways. That is sometimes very easy to identify and sometimes very difficult, because often people assume that the mother isn't a perpetrator, and so it can kind of confound things. But I wouldn't say I'm really an expert in that area. Well, I'll start right there.
Because my work is at the other end of like gerontology, and I'm wondering, and of course, where's the overlap? Where's the border between this and elder abuse, and in terms of legally, and in terms of what kind of work might be going on now, because people are living longer.
Yes. Maybe Laurel could actually answer that question better than I. I mean, there's always been some attention to elder abuse, not nearly enough. I think there's sort of a new wave of this.
Yeah, I don't really know a lot about it. I know that there was a point several years ago when at Sanctuary we were leading or very involved in a campaign to change New York State's laws about who could go into court to get a civil order of protection, meaning you didn't need to be in criminal court, but where the district attorney had to plead your case for an order of protection. And the law, until we succeeded in this campaign, was that you had to be married. We reached out to a number of organizations who worked with the elderly because we knew there was some elder abuse, and that was a perfect example. So a woman, and they all told us that they knew of cases where a woman was living alone. She was widowed or she was single, and she was one way or another elderly or retired, and she was having trouble meeting rent, and she would bring a man, a stranger, maybe he would be a roommate, he'd just rent a room to him, and he would then slowly start to take over and be in control, and she would be trapped. But they told us, and I not said with my knowledge about it, but I think there was an awareness that it was a problem, and we certainly, in addition, we have clearly had no cases, because one of the things we do now is we work very actively on trying to reform the divorce laws, and one of the reasons is that women who have been married do much worse financially. Married and divorced do much worse financially when they become elderly than those who were never married and essentially learn to take care of themselves. So there's a complicated series of issues around divorce laws, and a number of our cases that we know of, either ours or Legal Aid Society, does some of this, have been about elderly women in their 60s, 70s, who were living with somebody who abandoned them for years. So in that kind of situation, the finances it's always a big issue, getting away. But at that age, it becomes critical, and also if you're what your health is. So it's an important
Adult children are living back home and battering parents.
So that's the
large number of
those are
it has to do with the nature of dependent relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
How able-bodied they are, and very often it is.
Yeah, there is a lot of that.
Caretakers, or you have to, the horizon is a lot broader. It's often children, or I think it's the dependency often. Some the case that I've seen from my criminal work as a social worker before it became sexual, was often actually adult children taking pension checks and social security checks.
See a lot of that.
And adult children who were disabled themselves, substance abuse, had a variety of problems that weren't being dealt with, as they trickled down, and they were taking advantage of their disabled, dependent older parent. And it's the nature of dependency.
Yeah.
Biological gets exercised. In terms of public education around it, so it's the vulnerability and the nexus service also the protective services for adults. I mean, and where they're home visiting people and anybody, in terms of, it's the public education, we're talking about a coordinated community response. All environments in the community, in the city, whether it's the media, the courts, the police, social agencies, healthcare institutions, educational institutions, the arts, where people go, there needs to be a heightened sensitivity about the kinds of vulnerability people have and to bring it out of the shadows, which is why people telling their stories from cradle to the grave, that it's all sizes, shapes, races, ethnic groups, genders, gender orientations. The more that mosaic is publicly acknowledged, the more that we have this informed community that responds to what, Alyssa's really talking about. So that we, when you do outreach to nail salons or barbershops, which we do, that you have an enlightened community, not to make them the providers of the service, but, that you give people information, that you leave it in the barbershop, that you leave it you create an arena where people can have dialogue and not feel shamed.
But there's nowhere near the kind of resources that are really needed to make that kind of, nowhere near. I mean, you look at the sort of, the AIDS movement, the HIV/AIDS movement, which was very, very powerfully funded for quite a long time and had a huge cultural, social transformation impact. And that's just not something that has happened in the domestic violence movement. And I think it should, but it hasn't. So yes, there's a woman behind you. Yes, you.
Oh, okay. So I used to volunteer at the Barner Rape Crisis and Anti-Violence Center, which you mentioned in your earlier
Women's
talk.
Health and
Yes, and
really?
and one of the communities that in which the survivors experienced a lot of silence and rejection was within the LGBTQ community. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little about outreach in that community, if you've had any experience with that.
Yes, well actually, I don't exactly know how it happened, but we did end up doing a lot of interviews with the queer community in Queens when we were working in Queens. And so, and there was a lot of silence because they felt that there was really no support for them within their community, because no community wants to admit that there's battering going on, and a marginalized community wants to admit it in some ways even less than a non-marginalized community because it just adds to the marginalization. So we started a few sort of support groups. I mean, it wasn't like rocket science or anything too major, but it was just a way to try to bring people together to provide the support, mutual support. And there is a lesbian and gay anti-violence project in New York City, which, I don't know the depth of their work, but there is something. I mean, I think when I look over 30 years of this work, I sort of feel like 10 years ago I felt like there was maybe a little bit of a blossoming and there was more. Now I feel like there's less. Like I feel like it hasn't kept up with, and I'm a little out of touch. I don't live in New York City anymore, but I sort of feel like there's been a retrenchment of work out in the community, so I don't know what's really available for that community, and it's hard. It's like the elderly. I mean, the more dependent and isolated you are, the harder it is to get out and to be safe. And so the LGBTQ community is marginalized and supportless. And so how do you provide assistance for them?
Alyssa, I think in terms of the fact that the growth of the family justice centers has a little bit. In terms of being in the communities, we have them in all the boroughs. We have them right now in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, and there will soon be one in Manhattan. And this is kind of a concept of one-stop shopping. It's the co-location of services in terms of the courts, the DA, the police, and at least 20 community-based organizations representing diverse groups, representing all of them, lawyers and social workers. But there's a variety of, including ABP, the Anti-Violence Project that targets the LGBT community. So they are presence in the communities. But when you think that we can only rattle off one or two organizations, it supports,
in this big city,
in this big city that we don't have multiple right now. There are many community agencies, but there is a retrenchment. Everybody's fighting over very scarce dollars. you know? It's complicated.
Thank you.
I was curious though, did you interview the batterers? And what did they say, and what are the programs that you can set up to help them?
Well, I didn't interview batterers. I've not done an oral history with batterers. I've certainly talked to a lot of batterers in my day. Some too close for comfort, and but you know it's a very complicated question because I don't think anybody really knows what makes a batterer motivated to change. I mean, you put them in jail and they're not going to beat somebody up because they're in jail. But the minute they come out, or it's not a reformative experience. It's not a transformative experience. It's a holding tank. And so does that work? It works for the time he's in jail to keep the women and kids safe, but does it work, in any sort of longer way? I don't think the data shows that it works, if you look at real data. Do these therapeutic interventions work? For some people, they probably do work. Does some sort of a different approach like AA work? Well, no one's really tried it, but maybe that would work in a different way because it would be pervasive, and it would be any city you went to, you could go to a batterers group, and just like an AA group, but that doesn't exist either. It's very hard. I mean, there are men that stop battering. There's just no doubt about it. Do we know their stories? No, and that would be a great project to do. Like, how did you change? Why did you change? When did you change? And what's it like now? That would be a very powerful set of interviews, and then to sort of use that both in public education, because men are not listening, batterers are not listening to women about changing. Batterers are going to listen to other men who are going to sort of shame, motivate, and inspire them to make, to buck up and make a change. Sports people are talking about, there are initiatives.
Call to Men.
Call to Men, right,
Joe
Call to
Torre.
Men, right, and Joe Torre, right.
Joe Torre is
Right.
the leader in
So
that.
it's to organize all men, not
Yeah,
just batterers.
not right.
To make the tent very large, to hold them accountable to each other.
Right.
And it's responsibility.
But it's interesting because a Call to Men is actually quite a good organization that does some very interesting stuff, and they go on what they do is they reach out to all different populations of men and boys to talk to them about how they were socialized as male children to see women as lesser, as objects to satisfy them in many different ways. And that when they think back on how they were socialized and how that plays itself out in these very abusive and unequal relationships, and it's very much of a gender lens that they use that reaches for the patriarchal, is the heart of that patriarchal approach. And they do some, very creative stuff. And it's probably, none of the other things that have been tested have been shown to work. The Batters Intervention projects don't work. Jail
Restorative
children work.
justice, which is.
Right, there's restorative justice.
Yeah.
So people are trying.
It's really important. You're not going to have domestic violence unless the men change.
That's right. That's yeah.
And there's a book, which, of course, I can't remember the name of this book, where men who killed their partners were interviewed, and the words that they used were compared to the lines of popular songs and poetry, and they were almost identical. I loved her so much. That's
right.
what I had to do.
I couldn't live without her.
Yeah.
I had to.
And so I had to kill her, with vivid descriptions of how they did it too.
Yes. The murders these men commit are usually very, very brutal. They're not just killing, right? They're just sort of destroying. Someone back there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, I just kind of looked through the book that was
Yeah, yeah.
and under the educational
Yeah.
programming that I was looking at, have you ever envisioned any way that oral histories could be in the school system to kind of portray what domestic violence is,
Yeah.
what to look for, signs of the child in an abusive home, where to go for help, any ideas on that, please?
Well, let me answer that by sort of finishing up because it wraps in a little bit. so just to sort of tie this all up, so I got another fellowship, an Ashoka fellowship, which allowed me to sort of transition out of Connect and to also transition out of running an organization that was working in a particular community over an extended period of time to trying to create a methodology and a model that could be taught to people, or I could partner with people that wanted to use these kind of engagement and story gathering strategies to deepen what they were doing, to change what they were doing, but in particular to expand and deepen buy-in and participation. In a way, as I've gone through my whole life, what I am deeply invested in is increasing participation. That's kind of where it falls out, that I want to find ways to make the tent big and to bring many different voices in so that there can be, that people can build relationships and connections with each other and then build change out of that. So Threshold is the third organization, and so we are now trying to work with other organizations to use oral history in different kinds of settings to build change initiatives. And one of the partnerships we have is with a cluster of charter schools, working with high school students around using oral history as a way for them to develop. It's not focused on domestic violence, it's really focused on developing a sense of identity, self-critical awareness, connections with others in the school and in the community, and then identifying their values, their aspirational values for their community, developing a sort of a civic engagement project, and then doing the project. So it's kind of this tiered approach to learning who they are and then connecting who they are to something good in their community. So, and we're building it into a literacy it's like an English class. That's where it's being nested in the school, because we figure unless we nest it in the curriculum, people won't buy into it. It'll be add-on. Whereas if we can make it a class where they're learning to read and write, which we're working very hard to do, it will be bought by the system more likely. So just because this is leadership, and the sort of readings we've selected have to do with powerful activists who understand who they are and what their values are and how their values can be transformed into positive things in their community, doesn't mean that the same sort of strategies could be used for gender equality, for anti-violence work, for anti-racism work. I mean, it's sort of, you can plug different issues into it. So hopefully that will kind of fly, and it'll be something that can be, kind of used in a lot of different school settings. I still do work in domestic violence. I have sort of become a participatory action research person as well, and have designed all sorts of projects where people use more kind of data gathering in a participatory way, so that the participant, the consumer, the client, however they're defined in that setting, are actually the ones gathering knowledge, learning, analyzing information, and developing strategic change methods. And oral history often gets, put into there too. It's not the only method that Threshold uses. And we're doing, I thought there was one more slide. We're doing food justice work now. We're working with an organization that has 60 partners all over the United States to try to use, as we're defining it now, we're trying to create learning communities using participatory story gathering and other kinds of community engagement strategies, where the partner organizations can learn about their own programmatic strengths and weaknesses from the consumers in their community, because this is an effort to get low-income consumers, people on food stamps, to buy more local food. So the idea is that it will boost the economic activity in the community, it will improve people's health, and it will also improve their connection to their local farmers. So it kind of has this, you know, sort of multi-layered approach. So sometimes because people want things fast, they don't always want the oral history piece to be part of it. But one of the other sort of tricky ways that we've been able to convince people to use oral history is by creating public awareness and public art shows where we use oral history with people and then construct a narrative out of it that's much shorter, and link it through the magic of QR scans to photographs, and then use those in very public settings, postcards, online. We're doing this with the farm project, where we're making cards that are going to be in grocery stores, where you can scan the code and you can listen to the story of the farmer that grew that rutabaga. And you know, maybe you buy the rutabaga because you heard the story of the farmer, or just really weird ways of trying to get people's voice, both and their ideas, both brought into the public conversation, but also used as ways to inspire people to do something different, do something good. So that's what Threshold is doing. So more questions.
We have time for
A couple more
two or three more
questions?
questions maybe?
Yeah.
I've heard that numerous times people mention that the anti-trafficking movement is where the domestic violence movement was probably about 20 or 30 years ago.
Yes.
And I guess I'm wondering what, you know, what do you think about, are there connections? I know Sanctuary for Families does work in that area, but are there other connections, and where do you think that the anti-trafficking movement can learn from the domestic violence movement?
I think so. I mean, I think that some of the parallels are what I consider to be an over-reliance on criminal justice interventions, which are powerful and important, but not the exclusive way to solve the problem. And so I think that that's one of the conversations that I wish was happening with the trafficking movement around the place for those interventions, but the need for other kinds of assistance, interventions, and community engagement. Because, you know, again, you put a trafficker in jail, and there are 3 more traffickers who take that trafficker's place, or 10 more, or because it's economic, you know, because there's so much money in it. There's no way. It's like, you know, what's that mythical creature, you chop off the head and 2 grow? It's like that. And so it's important to send the message that it's illegal, it's wrong, you go to jail, there's punishment for it. That's obvious. But is that the way to change the problem? It's not the only way to change the problem. And so how do you really go about doing that is going to have a much more pervasive and community-focused way? And what supports are really there for these women, these people, but mostly women who are being trafficked? And how do you help them not go from one victim status to another? Because a lot of these women are very vulnerable, and they're not safe just because their trafficker is in jail, if you know what I mean. And so what happens, and how are we going to deal with that? I was on a panel with Rachel Lloyd about 3 months ago or so, and we afterwards sort of started to have that conversation, but that was the end of it. So. And she, you know, she's a real leader in that world and expressed concern and interest. But, you know, again, people are running around like chickens they're either running around because there's no resources and they're trying to get them, or they're running around because there are so many opportunities that they're trying to take. And I think Rachel's in that sort of position right now, where there's so much potential that she's just all over the place all the time. And, I don't know who's slowing down to kind of smell the roses and have the conversation.
The one comment I would make about trafficking and how in many ways it is like domestic violence, the big difference is that there's so much, such an extraordinary amount of, it's really slavery, the women who have been trafficked, and without criminal justice intervention, unless they are very lucky and found some way to actually run away, and sometimes they do that by, slitting their wrists and ending up in an emergency room, and they really can't get away. So I think Alyssa's exactly right. You have to have serious resources for them, and we do that. But without the criminal justice system, we really will never make any progress here. And the thing that needs to happen is changing men's views of what
women, right.
they are supposed to be doing. Are they supposed to be buying sex? Because it is men buying sex that makes this such a lucrative business. And so our own view of sanctuary now is really you work on both ends. You strengthen the criminal justice intervention. You make the penalties very clear and very serious so that they don't just go to jail for a year, but they go to jail for 5 years or 10 years, so that there is a deterrent effect, hopefully to some degree. And on the other end, you have to be talking about what feeds that industry, which is male demand for purchased sex. And then you have to be, on the third and the three prongs of it, you have to be working with the women and giving them places to be safe and counseling them and helping, because the level of trauma to them is, by and large, more profound than for domestic violence victims. But I think that's why there's so much interest in trafficking now, because that's just coming to light, that there's so much more of it than we even realize.
My question is about the medium of oral history in relation to domestic violence. So I feel like the content and findings of the interviews with women are, in a way, quite similar to what people working in frontline decisions with women experiencing domestic violence and social service agencies and advocates' office may notice intuitively through the work. And I'm wondering if you feel like there's something special about the medium of having these stories told in an oral history format that cause people to that register more with people, who didn't know that much, or you know what I mean? Like, was there something different with the format? Because it was interesting that you presented the material to advocates' offices and to people working in social service bureaucracies.
Right. Well, there was certainly something different in doing it with women. Just as the interview, the sort of site of the interview itself was a very powerful experience for the survivor, and had a kind of a transforming impact for them. So that, I think, is a very special consequence that can come out of doing an oral history interview with people whose voice is not usually heard. I don't know how people feel who are public figures all the time, and people, it may also have a very powerful effect on them, but these were women who no one ever asked their opinion about anything. So that in and of itself had a very powerful impact, albeit small. You know what I mean? 45 women had a very powerful experience. I had multiple powerful experiences, and that it could have stayed right there and been positive. The then transition of that to a more kind of testimony, I think had power because people who make decisions about other people's lives often do it in a very removed setting, or even in a removed way, because they're thinking about the problem from 1,000 feet. They're sort of looking at the problem and they're trying to figure out whether they can afford to do this, or who's going to be pissed off if they do this. There are lots of things that go into policy change that aren't so noble. But when you have someone in front of you talking about a very moving experience that they've had, where there's actually a correctable change that can be made, it puts flesh on the bones, you know, of an otherwise somewhat abstract decision-making process. And you know, now in 2013, a lot of that has changed. In 1993, there were no battered women talking about anything. You know, they were not a vocal. There were you know, a few books written by therapists and by people who worked with battered women, but there were this in a way sea change in trying to use personal stories as a way of communicating, as a way of getting people to feel about a problem rather than just think about a problem is a lot has changed, you know, in that period of time. So I think part of it was just the time, you know, that it was very different than it is now. Now, would it still have the same power? I actually think it would. I mean, I think that if you put together a similar kind of setting where you had people in any problem sort of talking in a powerful way about experiences, I mean, just look at what's happening in Congress with the folks from you know, Connecticut. I mean, those congressional leaders will not be able to not make a change because they're confronted with the parents of dead children. And, you know, marketers know this. People know that there's this real power in the voice of the, you know, the person that's been affected themselves, and that it makes a bigger impact than many other things. I mean, then you get the question about exploitation, though, you know, and what's ethical or exploitive to do with someone who has had a, you know, an experience that is difficult, that's painful, you know, how can you partner with them? Are you using them? Are you exploiting their opinion or story for your own benefit? I mean, my career has been made on other people's stories to some extent. So, you know, what's that about? You know, I've tried to give credit where credit is due. I've tried to include the people that I'm getting stories from, but nonetheless, I'm the one that has constructed the sort of outcomes of, I get to talk to you know what I mean? I get to take snips of their story, and so, you know, that's a kind of I think a set of critiques that everybody should go through, but I still think that there's an incredible opportunity for oral history and story gathering to be part of change work that we do. And that even if it's not about change work and it's only about that documentation of someone else's experience, that in and of itself has very powerful value. And that's a good in and of itself. Yeah.
We should like close and actually.
Okay, we'll close and we can talk after.
But we did experience in the 90s, about 93, we started teaching women in the community and at the knitting factory over. It was a 7-year period. We did audio, and they were based on themes of feminist consciousness. And the thing, and all these issues came up, incest and violence and great incest. The woman who did that went on to change the law in New York State on that subject. But she started, it was a forum where we all participated equally and then recorded our sort of our histories based on these themes over.
I didn't know that.
And I have all these archives. But this was something I see that you're doing. It's like getting together where these work, because this did work. And people, we did a lot on private and discussion about that.
Private.
And that became some became a national public television series at that. This was all in the 90s.
Well, thank you, everybody.